Okay, this is the Finches group, and we are going to talk about the evolution of sex. Students should learn about the relationship between evolution and sex, why sexual reproduction came to be, the impact of early marine life on modern sex, the benefits and costs of different evolutionary traits for sexual reproduction, and students should understand how sexual selection, sexual dimorphism, the sexual arms race, and the Red Queen hypothesis has conserved sex as a trait. So, early organisms primarily used asexual reproduction. However, asexual reproduction has little genetic variation. So, sexual reproduction evolved to include genetic variation, which is needed for survival.
So you made a little timeline on how sex has evolved over time. So around 6 million years ago, the first animals to adopt sexual reproduction were relatives of coral, and they were in the class Anthozoa. And then 570 million years ago, as organisms evolved and became more complex, they were able to direct sperm at eggs now. So they weren't just like the sperm wasn't just going out into the water and then it had to find the eggs on its own. It was easier for animals to then be conceived. And then around 500 million years ago, fish started laying eggs, but they were unprotected eggs, not like the eggs we think of today, where they have like a hard exterior or there's more of like a bubble around them to protect them. So all this was good that eggs were being laid, they were very easily eaten. And then around 385 million years ago, sharks were the first ones to invent sex. So scientists say this because sharks were the first to have a penis and then to lay eggs internally. So by being able to like really direct the sperm into the eggs, they were able to then develop pregnancy, which is a very good and protective way to have offspring. So then around 66 million years ago today, um, dinosaurs went extinct. And scientists kind of had a tough time figuring out how they had sex, but they theorize that it's similar to how cats have sex, just because dinosaurs are so big that if they were to mount, it likely wouldn't end well for the female. And then once dinosaurs went extinct, insects were then able to flourish. So today we can see that insects have very varied sex behaviors. They have very varied organ sizes, and they also have a lot of different like communication behaviors, and it's kind of different from species to species. So then 55 million years ago, when primates kind of took over, sex became kind of different for them because it was more of like a communication. Sex could be traded for like friendship or food, and it wasn't just like having sex to have offspring. And then 300,000 years ago, modern humans evolved, and then with them, sex also evolved. Sex is very different to humans because it is like more important to them. It's more of a societal thing. And so this was really different because when humans have sex and they have offspring, the offspring is very fragile and they can't really be born and like live on their own. So humans need to have like a connection with their partner and have love so they can like raise this child. So sex became very, very different once humans came to be. And as humans evolved, so did their physical traits for sex. So the human vagina was no longer tilted up, and then their hips became wider as the human skull became wider. And then the human penis also became bigger to fit the vagina as the shape of the vagina changed. And then now today, we have talks of sex beyond two organisms mating with each other. Sex can be engineered, it can be cloned, and today we're kind of discussing whether or not that's beneficial or ethical.
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about the benefits and costs of these evolutionary traits. Like mentioned earlier in the timeline, around 600 million years ago, creatures relative to modern day corals were the first to sexually reproduce by mass spawning. This is the concept by reproducing by casting sperm and eggs into the water. Even though corals produce large amounts of sperm and eggs in order to enhance reproductive success, the eggs were still vulnerable to the predators in the environment. And around 570 million years ago, the early fishes were able to evolve and develop a new, different method of sexual reproduction. In this case, the male fish could directly target their sperm to female eggs. However, these fertilized eggs are still tiny and fragile, and are also exposed on the ocean floor. As a result, these mechanisms leaves the eggs exposed to predators, which would decrease reproductive success and prevents the offspring from reaching maturity. As sharks develop the mechanism of internal fertilization that better protects the offspring, however, this mating behavior could still pose as harm for certain organisms. For example, in the case of sexual reproduction for elephants, the male mounts over the female's rear end, but this massive weight often leads to injuries and bone fractures in the female elephants. Furthermore, sexual selection might create burden or have led to extinction of certain species. The concept of intrasexual selection refers to the act of competing with members of one's own sex for opportunity to mate with the opposite sex. And this type of selection has led to runaway traits such as huge antlers on Irish elks. The large antlers were selected for, and as a result, over generations, the antlers got bigger and bigger to the point that it became a burden to the species. And it is a popular theory that these huge antlers may have caused the Irish elks to go extinct.
Some of the benefits, though, of sexual reproduction is with the evolution of it, genetic variability received a massive boost. With asexual reproduction, genetic variability was low since the offspring would just be a copy of its parent. Since sexual reproduction lets the organism give half of its DNA and another half from a different individual to its offspring, it increases the ability for the offspring to be better fit for the environment. One example of this would be if there was a disease that ran rampant through a population. If this was an asexually reproducing population, then the chances that the disease will raise through the population are very high. If it's a sexually reproducing population, then the chance is lower since there'll be multiple genotypes and at least some of them will have a resistance to the disease. Those individuals will then reproduce, be selected for, and help the population gain resistance over time. Along with the evolution of sex, there have been many different types of reproduction that have been evolved, and as said before, the earliest one was through the evolution of spawning, but spawning brought up problems as those eggs would be vulnerable and left out in the open. However, sharks came up with a new way of mating, penetrative sex. This is when the penis was evolved. And sharks would use it to directly deposit sperm inside the female, who then got pregnant. This evolution increased the chances that the offspring would survive, since the offspring would grow and develop inside the mother until it could fend for itself. It also increased the chances of fertilization being a success, as a penetrative sex allows for a more direct path between sperm and egg. Sex also brings with it a number of fitness changes. For example, sexual reproduction is known to select for the best possible mate, especially in animals. Animals will often judge potential mates to see which offers the best combination of genes. They will then choose to mate with that individual to ensure that the good genes are passed on in their bloodline. This is called the sexy sons hypothesis, that all individuals will choose the best suitable mate so that their offspring will inherit the genes and have the best chance to pass on their genetics. This drives populations to engage in sexual competition, which increases genetic variability and is overall good for the population. Along with that, there are many behavioral changes that come with sex, the main one being social changes. Animals of all shapes and sizes engage in social behaviors, and sex, along with love, is considered to be one of those behaviors. One example of the evolution of sex is beneficial to behavior is in bonobos. Bonobos are apes that live in troops. These troops are very tightly knit and engage with each other often. Sex is used in many forms of the bonobos, but arguably the most important way it is used is to solve conflicts between them. If there is a conflict, the bonobos will solve it with sex. And this sex helps them bond with each other and strengthen their social relationships. Bonobos are not the only example of sex being used in a way to strengthen social groups. Wolves, cats, and even humans all engage in sex as a way to connect with one another, which shows that the evolution of sex directly benefits each individual, even at the social scale.
So in terms of selection pressures, we already discussed how natural selection has favored sexual recombination for genetic diversity and internal fertilization. But there's also some other selection pressures which have conserved sex as a trait, including sexual selection, sexual dimorphism, and a sexual arms race between the sexes.
The two types of sexual selection are intrasexual selection and intersexual selection. And intrasexual selection is competition between members of the same sex for access to a mating partner. An example of this are antlers in male deer. Male deer use their antlers to fight each other off and compete for access to mating partners. And intersexual ability has to do with the ability to attract a mate. And here's an example of a male peacock, which has a really colorful tail, which it uses to signify its good genes to a partner. And sexual selection can lead to a phenomenon known as sexual dimorphism, which is the morphological differences between different sexes of the same species. So using the previous example, on the right, there is a male deer with antlers and a female deer without antlers. And here with the peacock, the male has a large colorful tail while the female doesn't. And selection pressures can also lead to sexual traits that evolve, which can reduce the survival of the individual, but increase their fitness. So an example of that is with honeybees, which have a colony, and the colony will have a queen bee, which mates with many drone males. And when males finish mating with the queen bee, their penis rips away from their body, which kills them. And the severed penis acts as a plug, preventing other males from mating with the queen bee. And while that reduces the chance of, like, eliminates the male's chance to mate again and potentially reproduce that way, it's overall increases the male's fitness because there's so many drones. Like there's hundreds or thousands of drones per queen bee. So this maximizes their genetic fitness.
So another selection pressure is a phenomenon known as a sexual arms race between males and females. So anytime we talk about an evolutionary arms race, we're talking about co-evolving genes, evolving adaptations and counter adaptations against one another. So it's important to know that males and females have conflicting reproductive goals often. For males, often their goal is to maximize their paternity and have the most offspring with their genes. However, the male mating behavior may harm the females. For instance, there's something called traumatic insemination, which occurs in some bedbug species. You can see here in the photo that the male who is attempting to inseminate the female is actually puncturing her abdomen, which can be harmful to the female. There's also sometimes toxic proteins in semen, which can excessively harm females. It's also important to know that females expend a lot of their energy during pregnancy and rearing their offspring. So too much mating means more energy that will be expended rearing offspring. So another concept is sexual antagonistic coevolution, which kind of describes what I just talked about. It basically states that sex characteristics of males and females will change over time to counteract traits that maximize the fitness of the opposite sex. So what this means is that the conflicting characteristics of males and females actually act as selection pressures for traits that maximize each sex's own reproductive success. So another important hypothesis in the theory of sexual evolution is the Red Queen hypothesis, which hypothesizes the same phenomena as the evolutionary arms race, except between species. So the name origin comes from the Lewis Carroll novel Through the Looking Glass, adopted for the Alice in Wonderland movie, in which the Red Queen tells Alice it takes all the running you do to keep in the same place. So in evolutionary terms, this means that species that exist at the expense of one another, particularly parasite-host relationships or predator-prey relationships, will continue to evolve traits running in the same place so that one never has a survival advantage that drives the other to extinction.
So, a couple things that the team thought was interesting. I thought it was interesting to learn that corals were the first organisms to sexually reproduce via spawning, and that the evolution for sex began in the ocean.
I thought it was really interesting that sharks were one of the first species to practice pregnancy because I feel like we normally don't think of sharks in that way. So I think that was really cool.
I thought it was cool how sex evolved to be associated with social bonding and primates, and how that's led to such a social significance that sex has in human society today.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting how male insects would sacrifice themselves in order to win the sexual arms race and increase their reproductive success.
So, our take home message is that asexual reproduction preceded sexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction has been evolving for billions of years to reach the level we see today. Students should know that the benefits of sexual reproduction outweigh the costs by increasing genetic variability and engaging in differential reproductive success. Selection pressures acting on sexual traits include inter and intra sexual selection, sexual dimorphism, and the sexual arms race. The Red Queen hypothesis may explain why sexual reproduction is beneficial to competing co evolving species. And these are our citations. Thank you.